As an emerging innovation district, we wanted to get the insights and expertise from this great panel today. One such effort that we're working on here is called the Digital City, where we're trying to marry smart city infrastructure with entrepreneurial ecosystem building and doing it around corporate and government and institutional anchors that are here for cluster-based innovation and entrepreneurship. This has been something that's been in the works for a while, but there's a wide variety of other efforts that are happening here in Memphis. And so we're here to learn as well how we better position ourselves. But one of the key ingredients that we think here is how do we civically realign as partners to work better together. And so that's a little context for some of the speakers as we get into the run of show today. We're going to spend 10 minutes with each of the speakers, opening it up for Q&A after each one of those 10-minute sessions. But before we did that, I wanted to make sure that we did some brief intros. I'm going to ask each of the speakers to just give a minute or so on who they are, who they represent, and some of the things they're working on. And we'll obviously get into more detail when we're into their segment of this run of show. We consider you all brokers of innovation, brokering capital, technology, and talent. And we're excited to learn about actionable steps that we can be looking forward to using in our community and hopefully other communities across the nation. And I would love it if we could start with Michael Pegues, who's the CIO of the city of Aurora in Illinois. Could you just give a brief background on yourself?
Absolutely. So you hit it on the head. So my name is Mike Pegues. I am the Chief Information Officer at the city of Aurora. I was actually appointed by Mayor Irving back in June of 2017. My background prior to that is basically the public sector. I've worked there for the last 25 or so years, did a stint working for the Department of Defense, but I don't even consider myself a public sector CIO because it has kind of a stigma that comes along with it. But I did come back to the public sector to work for the mayor, who was the 59th mayor of the second largest city in the state of Illinois, and actually the first African-American mayor in its history. So we have a long relationship, and out of friendship and sheer generosity, I decided to come work. One of the major things that actually interested me about coming to the city of Aurora was the social impact. And that's what the mayor wanted to focus on, using technology as an underpinning foundation to help drive economic development, right? To increase public safety, to promote education and also government efficiencies. So I've been working here, and we've kicked off our Smart City initiative probably early 2018. Then we're still on this journey today. I'm glad to be here with everyone.
Great, thank you, Michael. And I would love it if David Adams, if you didn't mind, the CIO for the University of Cincinnati, just giving a brief intro.
Absolutely. So I'm a little bit different kind of CIO. I'm a Chief Innovation Officer here at the University of Cincinnati. It's a new position here at the University of Cincinnati. I'm also the architect of the Cincinnati Innovation District. And from a background standpoint, actually a former industrial engineer. I grew up in the software industry. So I spent the bulk of my career in the software industry, was fortunate enough to be part of a unicorn back in the late 90s, early 2000s. We didn't even have that term, but we helped create the supply chain management marketplace as we know it today. And I think that's really very relevant to this discussion that we're going to have this today. I also worked in public service. I got a very strange phone call from a gentleman named Mitch Daniels, who was governor of Indiana, who was bringing business executives into state government as he was leading his administration. And I was asked to turn around the public pension system of the state of Indiana, which you can see is no relation to the software industry. So I did that. Then I chaired the Teachers Retirement Fund, and we combined the two systems. And so I've now been in higher ed for the last 6 years. And I believe the work that we're talking about this morning, and we'll talk more about, it's critically important, because I know firsthand as a former software executive, the challenges of being here in the Midwest when a lot of the really cool opportunities seem to be on the coast. And so we're working real hard to change that every day.
Great, thank you, David. And Bruce, would you mind just giving a brief background, and we're going to segue into your 10-minute session right after that. But if you didn't mind, just giving a brief intro.
Absolutely. First of all, it's great to be with everyone. My name is Bruce Katz. I run a finance lab at Drexel University. With regard to innovation districts, several things are key. When I was at Brookings running the Metropolitan Policy Program, Julie Wagner and I began to notice, and I'll talk about this spatial dynamic in the United States, Europe, Australia, Israel, and beyond, and started writing about this in 2013, 2014, naming innovation districts. As I'll talk about, it actually comes from Barcelona. It wasn't a name we came up with. It was something that, like good Americans, we just stole from the Europeans. Since then, I've been working with many of the innovation districts that are driven by tier 1 research universities like Carnegie Mellon and Pitt in Pittsburgh, or WashU and others in St. Louis, or Georgia Tech in Atlanta, or outside the US, Ben Gurion University in Beersheba, Israel, et cetera. I think this conversation could not be more timely, as we should discuss, given the EDA announcement last week of $1 billion Build Back Better fund, which very much has tech hubs and innovation districts in their line of sight. So a lot of background from the think tank and do tank sort of world.
Well, thank you, Bruce, for that, and we're gonna stay with you for the first portion of this. Really appreciate you taking some time out of your day. Maybe if you didn't mind, for those who are watching, could you just give us kind of your definition of innovation districts and how communities could start better positioning themselves in that manner?
No, absolutely. And I mean, I'll be very frank with everyone on the phone. I mean, my definition of innovation districts tends to evolve and iterate. Though I do think this dynamic of really what are platforms for mashups of corporations, startups, scale-ups, advanced research universities, healthcare, manufacturing, incubators, accelerators, investors, community colleges. Post-pandemic, even as we all talk about remote work and we talk about decentralization and so forth, I think the innovation district kind of notion is probably more important than it was pre-pandemic. And the genesis of this really starts both in the United States, Europe, a few other places, as almost a reaction to the geography of innovation, which dominated particularly the US, but other countries as well, post-World War II, where if you wanted to find an innovation center of excellence, generally speaking, you would get in your car in a central business district, drive 30 miles to some isolated research park, which might be dominated by a particular corporation or might involve multiple corporations, but usually in their own siloed, isolated campuses. It was really almost like a keep secret. I think as we moved into this century and we began to think more about networks and co-created problem solving, whether it's on the technology side or whether it's on the social side, what began to happen was in European cities like Barcelona, but also naturally off this incredible base we have in the United States of advanced research universities, we began to see the mingling of research, commercialization, startup and scale-up companies with mature corporations, whether they are based in those particular metropolitan areas or whether they begin to gravitate to those cities and metros because of the distinctive competitive advantages and research chops of different places. I mean, the bottom line, in the United States, for dozens and dozens of cities and metropolitan areas, they have very distinctive economies and very distinctive niches around next generation technologies because of how much basic science and ultimately applied research and commercialization has become really an engine in this country for innovations in the digital world, around life sciences, around clean energy. I mean, you name it. We have really dozens of places in the US that because of this massing and aggregation and accumulation of research assets and corporate assets, we've begun to see this concentrated effect. So really what I think began to happen in a natural, organic way, this innovation districts are not a government program, though there actually seem to be becoming one. They're really an organic market dynamic of, innovation is a collaborative act, and proximity and density and co-location. And, a lot of people, not surprisingly, want to be in walkable, livable communities with mixed use and multiple amenities. So what began really as almost a reaction to this isolated, science park approach going back to the post-war World War II era, 1970s, now has begun to sort of, with the rise of cities, become really sort of a sort of almost an asset class, to use Wall Street terminology, that can be proven to have serious returns, not just on idea generation, but on formation and growth of companies and the application or invention of technologies. So fast forward to today, post-pandemic, and basically focus on what the Biden administration is doing with the economic development dollars that come through the American Rescue Plan, $3 billion going to EDA, $1 billion of which is going to go to Build Back Better funds, some of which will be for planning, ultimately leading to actual project implementation. But this is just a dry run for the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, which includes a significant commitment to diversifying the spatial concentration of innovation in the United States off, quote unquote, the coast. Think Silicon Valley, think Boston, think New York, which along with Los Angeles and a few other places garners the lion's share of venture capital in the United States. So this is a strategic move at the national level to really diversify our economy spatially through this incredible platform we have all over the country of advanced research and other technology mature or enabled companies and so forth, and really grow that at scale. And so for anyone listening to this, even though up to now I mostly have focused on what you would consider to be the tech side of Innovation District, the one last thing I'd stress is as we move forward, given the nature of what is hoping to be an inclusive recovery in the U.S., what will be absolutely critical in designing, financing, and delivering these districts won't just be the business side of it, but the inclusion side of it. Think workforce development, think supplier diversity, think value creation as whole districts get built out, with the potential for revenue streams to focus on neighborhood revitalization. Think about inclusive entrepreneurship and the ability to sort of crack the code from what is a fairly narrow view of just commercialization of advanced R&D, but more general, larger continuum of enterprises that have tech-enabled, focus on Black founders, Latino founders, and so forth. So I think what's about to happen in the next couple of years, which will basically take whatever typology of innovation districts exists either in the US or outside the US, we're about to go through a major investment of federal resources into essentially a common bet that co-location, concentration, particularly in areas that are close to, which many parts of the US our advanced universities are they're just blocks away from areas of super high poverty, deprivation, disinvestment. I think this is about to become a much more holistic, integrated approach, not just to the growth of innovation and economic, potential, but also broader commitment to inclusive recovery and the knitting together what, for the most part, has never really been done in the United States. Anchor institutions whether the universities, hospitals, or large corporations, startups, et cetera, and the communities that they literally are a stone's throw away. So there is enormous potential for us to create a new model, essentially, of inclusive innovation, which is, a wonderful aspirational goal, hasn't really been the focus yet in a substantial way of the growth model in the United States. So I think we're embarking on a journey together. There's no, anyone who thinks innovation is just sort of like here's something you just take off the shelf and apply. It almost violates the very notion of innovation in the first place. But I think we're taking sort of a model that was maturing over the past 15 years in the US, and now we're about to take it to achieve its full impact on the growth of quality jobs, the spatial diversification of our economy, and most importantly, inclusive outcomes for communities and people.
And Bruce, thanks for that, because you touched on many components there, ranging from obviously anchors and creating meaningful, innovative jobs, but livable communities and inclusion and working together in partnership. I did want to have one follow-up before we bring others into this conversation. You speak of, in your new localism, philosophy around financial mechanisms that need to be tapped in order to advance many of the things that you're talking to, growth models, financial structures, and being creative. Could you touch on that for just a moment?
Well, absolutely. I think I frankly thought that investments, whether they were with tax incentives like opportunity zones or without tax incentives, would have been flowing more naturally to the heartland of the United States over the past 15 years, because I regard innovation districts, frankly, just as another asset class, and that global capital could ultimately invest in. But the spatial hold of certain parts of our country on the global investment community has been hard to break. So I think if we're going to talk about capital and we're going to talk about innovation districts, we're not talking really about one form of capital. We're talking about multiple forms of capital, because we're talking about a continuum of enterprises that need different kinds of capital that's fit to purpose and fit to their needs. So to some extent, I think what we're talking about is public capital here, because of the post-pandemic environment, acting as a catalyst. But ultimately, as we begin to make markets, I think we're talking about equity investments, both from traditional venture that begin to find places off the coast, to revenue-based financing for local entrepreneurs who can't support or don't have the collateral for traditional debt products, from banks and others. So new kinds of equity products or equity-like products, I think, are going to be invented in the post-pandemic era. And I do think also, in terms of capital providers, what we're going to see is a broader suite of capital providers across the US. I think what the pandemic showed, particularly with the allocation of the PPP, of the Paycheck Protection Program, is that CDFIs, alternative lenders, fintech began to come into their own, and began to break the mold in terms of how to connect particularly Black and brown entrepreneurs and other innovators who aren't in the traditional tech commercialization space, how to really provide quality capital to those entrepreneurs through networks, through intermediaries, through entrepreneurial support organizations, through ecosystems. So I think basically entrepreneurial finance and innovation finance is going to get reinvented in the next couple of years with this burst of public capital and frankly, people rediscovering a large portion of the US with all the assets and advantages that it has, but it's been overlooked for long periods of time, either because of global investors or because of the strictures of traditional debt products, et cetera, from banks and others.
Well, great. And I want to come back to that because I want to hear from the other two panelists on that particular piece a little bit later. But I wanted to go ahead and bring David Adams in and make sure, we understand a little bit more of what they're doing in terms of the Cincinnati Innovation District. David, would you mind just kind of giving a brief background on, I guess, what was a vision that's becoming a reality in your neck of the woods so that we can all have a better understanding?
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And, appreciate the comments that Bruce has made, because it's a recognition that, these anchor institutions is a supplier of one key thing that every organization we've talked to, from startups to Fortune 500 key companies, need. It's access to talent, whether it be, student talent, research talent, or educational resources. It's all been about talent. So the President University created the Office of Innovation with one simple function. How do we connect the economic engine of the University of Cincinnati? How do we connect it with the business community? And if you think about Cincinnati and Memphis, we have a lot of parallels. As a university, we're a fairly large institution. We've got about 47,000 students. We do a little over 500 million a year in research. Well, we got a highly diverse set of colleges here. We got 14 different colleges, and it mirrors very well with the diversity of industries that we have here in Cincinnati. We have companies, everything from Kroger to Fifth Third Bank and P&G, to Ralston Purina just announced they're building a manufacturing plant here. So there's a highly diverse set of industries that candidly we're embracing very much in this economy of digital transformation. But as we went out and talked to businesses, we recognized when we asked them, what's your biggest need? They said, we need access to talent. And so we recognized we didn't have a place for them to physically connect with us. So the president of the university gave me an old Sears building based, it was built in 1929. We converted it into something we affectionately called the 1819 Innovation Hub. And we created a place where companies from startup to Fortune 500 companies can set up a location, a small innovation center where they can bring their employees to connect with our university, but as importantly, to connect with each other. There's just these creative collisions that happen on a daily basis. And it was a small facility. It's about 125,000 square feet. I'm happy to share with you and the audience that, we launched this in 2018. We're at capacity today as we sit here in 2021. So we're not even 3 years old, which just illustrates the demand for organizations to get connected to that talent. From there in 2019, we launched something called the Digital Futures Complex. This is a public-private partnership. So it's a private developer, and it's 600,000 square feet, but we as a university committed to take 1/3 of that to create an interdisciplinary research institute focused on digital transformation. Every business, every industry we're all in, we're all being digitally transformed. So how do we bring researchers from across campus to work on problems that matter? And so our focus is, how do we listen to industry, connect them with our researchers to help solve the problems that are meaningful to them? So that was the next phase of all this. But then in 2020, March of last year, in fact, it was the governor, lieutenant governor's last public appearance prior to COVID, we unveiled the Cincinnati Innovation District. One of the things that we recognized is that we had to ensure that the local economy of Cincinnati remained strong, but if we're going to attract other businesses, we needed to have a brand, a way to communicate to those businesses. So we came up with the brand called Cincinnati Innovation District, and this has now been replicated in Columbus and Cleveland. So the Cleveland Innovation District got announced in January, the Columbus Innovation District got announced in February, all based off this model. But what was important about it is the state economic division infused $100 million into us, because it's all about accelerating this effort. And we couldn't do this on our own. So we're accelerating the number of STEM grads coming out of this university over the next 10 years. We're accelerating the number of research with the whole intent of how do we build a bigger pipeline to help support the businesses that are here today, as well as the companies that want to be here today, or here in the future, if you will. So that's where we're at. I would also just share, in 2020, even with COVID, we signed 4 new corporate partners. Companies, even though they physically couldn't take the space, still wanted to find a way to connect with the resources of the university and also the resources that exist here. We're also fortunate that Cincinnati Children's, which is one of the top 3 children's hospitals, is located in this area, as well as the EPA is located here. So again, there's a lot of innovation assets. As we look forward, our view is we just need to continue to accelerate the efforts that have been built here. And as we look at this model, I would share with the group here, we've been very intentional about this model. This has been very purpose-built, and we like to believe we've built in years what other communities have taken decades. And we don't say that this is the model, we say it's a model. And I welcome any of the viewers here today that if you'd like to come to Cincinnati and see what we're doing, we're happy to share this model, because candidly, here in the Midwest, we all have got to get this figured out. And we think we've got a model here that's based on a few principles. We break it down to 4. One is, this is a needs-based model. We're not actually a solution chasing a problem. In fact, one of the CEOs of one of our Fortune 500 companies said, you're the first university to ever ask us about our problems. You're not telling us what you do. And what we're doing is we're reorienting our university to help support the needs. So it's taken a very needs-based approach. And candidly, I think that's one of the reasons why we've grown so rapidly. The second is just a recognition, and Bruce talked about it. The world we're living in, it continues to evolve at a pace that none of us have seen. So how do we create speed with everything we do? So we've worked really hard to reduce all the friction associated with accessing the resources. One of the things that we heard when we talked to companies from a university standpoint is you're hard to work with. Your IP policies don't work for us. So we overhauled everything. We've reduced all the friction. If a company wants to engage and own the intellectual property associated with working with us, they get to own it. We created standard contracts. We've eliminated as much friction as possible. It actually became Ohio's IP promise that the Lieutenant Governor unveiled. And now all 14 public colleges and universities here are here to reduce friction. And we see this as an attraction mechanism for us as well. So needs-based, speed. The other key piece to this is access. We recognize that a company can't work to figure out how to access this talent, be it a researcher, be it a student. So we created a single point of contact within my organization that will actually facilitate the coordination of the resources that companies need. And this isn't just accessing university resources, but as they're working to collaborate with each other, how do we convene and bring the right resources together to help support their needs? And the last piece of this that we found really important is it's all about leadership, that one-stop shop. If an organization has to figure out in the community, where do they go to kind of get this access, they're going to go somewhere else. So by having an organization focused on this with a leader who has responsibility for this, for the community, becomes really, really important. And we think those 4 elements have been critically important for what we've been able to build today and where we're going.
Well, David, I'm going to try to blend a question from the audience here with one that I have. We're working on this digital city concept that I was speaking of before. The University of Memphis is our lead academic partner at this point. And we're in this kind of strategic planning and vision of laying out how to, work in a public-private fashion where you have a university partner bringing the right faculty and student research to the table. So any advice that you might have for the university, for those who may be on the call today? And then we have a question from the West Coast, which is about, what about regions who have far fewer academic resources? Can they still succeed not having as much strength in that particular area?
Yeah, so to your first question, you're starting to see this pop up at more and more universities, but whether it's a chief innovation officer or head of economic development, you're starting to see a separate office get created with the sole purpose of how do we connect the university with the business community. And if you think about it from a supply chain standpoint, that's been a highly disconnected thing. Universities traditionally have said, hey, we produce graduates, we hope it works out well for you, right? And we've said to high schools, hey, send your kids to our university. We're very much looking now to take a more integrated approach and try to understand the needs of employers. Well, you need an office to be able to do that. Likewise, we're actually working with employers to connect back to high schools and middle schools about how do we inspire young minds to think about the kinds of opportunities that exist if you get these college degrees. So that's one aspect of it that becomes really important. The anchor research institution is important, but I would say really if you think about this categorically, it really gets down into workforce talent, research talent, and educational resources. And I want to emphasize real quick before I get to the question on educational resources, we're finding out with every business we talk to, it's not just about getting the college grads, but how do we keep our employees up in terms of the digital skills? How do we as a university start to work with the unemployed, the underemployed, and low income to help get them the digital skills so they can have productive lives in the workforce? So there are other places that may not have a research institution, but might have the educational resources to produce the workforce to support the local economy. And I think that's where, if you look at Bruce's work with the new localism, this is really all about cities. And within your community, what are the resources to help supply the talent needs of the organizations that are there? And if you make enough noise about it, this talent issue is not going away. Other companies are going to need it. And if they know your location where they can actually get access to that talent, there's a good chance you're going to have an opportunity to attract that business and candidly attract other individuals that want to be around like-minded opportunities.
Well, thanks for that breakdown. And you're speaking to some things that I want to segue here into what Michael is working on. Michael, I was hoping, if you didn't mind, could you give kind of a brief background on the work that you are doing? I was specifically interested in your deliberate approach into not just using technology, but intersecting it with things such as jobs and workforce, and even looking at housing in your particular community. Could you just kind of give a brief background on kind of how this all got started and where you're going now that you're a few years in with a lot of this great work?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, just to kind of segue on what Bruce and David have both articulated in terms of, there being an economic need or some type of crisis that's basically impacted that community, right? Again, the mayor asked me to be the CIO back in June of 2017 because the city of Aurora had just coming out of, this phase of this manufacturing era, right? Where, Caterpillar was the #1 employer for the city of Aurora, right? For decades, like from the late 60s on until just, 2017, 2018, they employed, anywhere, I think it was close to 7,500, employees there in the city of Aurora. City of Aurora is a mid-sized city of 210,000, right? We sit in 4 counties with a very diverse population. And, even my parents, I was born in Mississippi, we moved here in the early 70s during the Great African American Migration for jobs. My parents and my aunts and uncles, everyone either worked at Caterpillar, International Harvester, Barbara Green, or one of these manufacturing companies. And those you start to see them decline, as we moved into the 4th industrial revolution, where it became more of a service-based industry, right? So the mayor is thinking, what do we need to do to reinvent ourselves? And as Caterpillar closed their doors, now you have the #1 employer in the city of Aurora is Amazon, right? So so it's like, how do we take the assets that we have today and reinvent ourselves for the future? How do we make ourselves smart, future proof, right? And it goes back to what, David and also Bruce was talking about in terms of the human capital, right? We have multiple community colleges and universities in the area. We got NIU right up the street, right? We got the University of Illinois, where, some of the top technology executives in the nation have come out of, have graduated from NIU, but gone to different locations on the East Coast or the West Coast, right? To be part of that whole movement, right? Because of other things that we could talk about in terms of business and, tax incentives here with the, state government. That's a whole nother conversation, right? Or their lack of. But we also have IMSA, which is the Illinois Mathematics and Science Academy, which is the #1 STEM academy in the United States. Matter of fact, Steve Chan, the co-founder from YouTube, graduated from IMSA out of high school and then went on to, University of Illinois, right? And he's still providing philanthropy there, right? We also have, a computational prototype advanced research high school here in Aurora as well. So you can see this mix of human capital that city has. Then you have the people, then you have the universities, then you have the need for jobs, right? Based on your demographics, and whether it's, the younger generation but don't forget about the older generation. You can reskill those individuals for the future as well. So how do we take that and bring that into some type of ecosystem, right? And so what we did at the city of Aurora and how it came about was we created the 605 Innovation District, right? The city of Aurora consists of 6 zip codes, right? We sit across 4 counties, right? And with that, we were looking to say, well, let's look at these other locations like in Boston on the West Coast, and we mentioned like Barcelona, and said, why don't we look to create an area where we can do innovation and create a sandbox, and we got our planners there, the mayor's office, everybody, I'm thinking like, but why would we limit ourselves to a district? Why don't we just make the whole damn city the innovation district, right? Because as we start talking about smart cities and innovation districts, these have no boundaries. They're not going to stop at a street or a wall, right? And keep it in mind, we're in this fourth industrial revolution where we're talking about all this cyberspace, right? And we're starting to move into that fifth industrial revolution where we start to talk about, artificial intelligence, and we're already there. We just don't know it yet. We haven't kind of actualized it. So we said, let's look at making, the city itself the innovation district. I mean, and I'm going to be quite blunt. I mean, it was a marketing stunt in the beginning that ended up working, right? And it caught the governor's attention. Governor Pritzker, who was one of the founders of, the innovation incubator there in Chicago, and he's like, what, I think you guys got something here. Then we said, well, how do we fund this thing? We got the people, because remember, social innovation can never be a project run by one group of people for the benefit of another. So we got to bring in the community. We got to bring in the universities. We have to bring in the large enterprise, but not forgetting the entrepreneurs, because as we can see today, some of the top tech companies are what? Facebook, Google, Amazon, and they all started in the garage, right? So you never know who that small entrepreneur may be. So let's get them in. It's great to have the larger enterprise because they're going to have the deep pockets. But again, from lessons learned, hey, when Caterpillar left, it pretty much sunk the economy of the city of Aurora. You don't want to get in that situation where you can be leveraged. You got to do some basic contingency planning. And also, from my past experience, where prior I worked at Morgan Stanley, although on the cybersecurity side of the house, and I was based in Budapest, and seeing what Budapest had done after the wall had fell in 1989, and they basically reinvented themselves. Now they're a shared service financial center, in the Eastern, bloc of Europe, and it's thriving. Right, you have some of the best tech companies coming out of there, and Estonia, right? Don't forget about where Skype came from. It came from Estonia. One of the original founders of really like the e-government, and digital services. And just seeing that environment, I was like, why can't we just replicate that here, right? In Aurora, So that was kind of the thought process. But then I started thinking, we need funding, right? And when it comes to government, yeah, that's probably not the best place to go. So what we had to do was contact some of our past contacts on Wall Street, right? Private equity, right? I'm a big proponent of public-private partnership, but it has to be backed by private equity, and it needs to be a mutual partnership, right? Because a lot of these private equity firms, as I think Dave was mentioning or alluding to, with the Biden administration, they're looking to where they can invest their money, right? They're not going to put it in the stock market. I can guarantee you that, because it's way too volatile right now with the current administration, right? And everything that's going on. So what do they look towards? They look to say, hey, what qualified opportunity zones there? Hey, how can we invest this back into social impact, into your community, into the people? Right? I need talent. We need people in our company, seats and butts, butts and seat actually doing the work, right? And again, I'm going to throw out there a bad world in the academic world. So don't kill me here, Dave or Bruce. But we need to look at education reform, right? Because many of the kids coming out of high school today, they don't really need college to start working. I'm a big proponent of college. But, there's a certain demographics throughout the United States that don't have the access to funds and capitals to go to college, right? So, and I was one of those, and I got my MBA, the Morgan Stanley paid for it, right? I couldn't pay for it, right? So we need to look at all these different nuances and dynamics. And I think that's where the innovation district kind of helped. I think that's where those ecosystems and those incubators and those accelerators, you bring all that talent together. And trust me, you can ask that question, whatever question is, and I bet you the answer is in the room, right? But you got to pull it together, right? And that's what we're trying to do with the city of Aurora. You know, one of the other things that we had success with, we had a lot of hype, you know, was when the governor heard about it, you know, and we'd start working on this. And by no means is this thing anywhere close to 100%. You know, this is a work in progress, right? It's about what are those core principles that we're looking at. I know David was talking about that, you know, and as a city, we got to focus on how do we become a better run city? How do we become a safer city? How do we become a more connected city? Because we haven't gotten into the digital divide aspect yet, right? And how do we become a more prosperous city? And those were the fundamental goals of the innovation district. And the government being a partner in that and having that convening power, but we try to keep them out of the innovation piece because, you know, innovation, government, I mean, bureaucracies, that's like oil and water. They just don't mix very well, right? And you let the private sector kind of drive the innovation, right? And we've been able to track, you know, different startup companies, and we've been able to attract some mid-sized companies who have relocated their headquarters to the city of Aurora. And, you know, we've attracted a few large companies, and keeping in mind, even the Chicago Mercantile Exchange has moved their sales and trading floor out to the city of Aurora because of an asset we have with our broadband fiber optic network, right? And you can think about the peripheral business around that is going to attract with high frequency trading. So you have all these different elements, and you know, we could talk for weeks about this stuff, but trying to pull that stuff together into something that really makes sense, you get about, you know, don't forget about, you know, like the different initiatives around jobs. How do you create new market tax incentives? How do you create incentives? I can provide cheap space. How can I provide data center access? How can I provide marketing, fiber net access? You know, all these different things to help these entrepreneurs to get started up. You got to bring it into a one-stop shop location, you know, and that's the innovation district.
Well, Michael, and I want to open this question up to the group here as well. But Michael, you touched on so many different groups there, right? In terms of, you know, state, city, private equity, workforce. I mean, we can go on and on. How were you able to get folks to sit at the table with you, row in the same direction with you? And who are examples of those types of folks? What roles did they sit in within your community?
Right, absolutely. So, you know, it is a multi-pronged answer, right? And I think this is where the city and the state, the city being the mayor, and the governor has this convening power. They can pretty much snap their finger and get anybody in the room at any given time, whether that's in, you know, within the city on the constituent side, to the business side, you know, or at, you know, or at the state level, right? That's where I think the government plays a huge part in getting those individuals around the table, right? But again, you know, separating those boundaries, and then you start to talk about the execution in terms of plans and things like that. You get the universities, and you get also the you know, the private sector involved to kind of move things forward.
Well, Bruce, to Michael's point, you know, a lot of times in the communities, I know here in Memphis, you know, we have to deal with sometimes entrenched thinking, and there's prescriptive funding. And so a lot of the things Michael was talking about, this alignment of partners and being able to get people to row in the same direction. In your opinion, how are you seeing this being done out there, or what would you recommend to communities who are having challenges navigating that?
Well, the bottom line is I think we're about to see a torrent of federal funding that goes to places that get their act together. So if, you know, it's in some ways, this is going to be a big test. Collaboration sounds like an easy word. It's actually quite difficult. The innovation districts that have really matured over the past 15 years did receive enormous amounts of federal funding, particularly on the R&D side. Whether it's from the military, whether it's NIH, whether it's NSF, whether it's the Department of Energy, et cetera, et cetera. But they were collaborative, there were collaborations across sectors. Carnegie Mellon, Pitt, UPMC, the city government, the state government, Philly, obviously, Drexel, Penn, the hospitals, again, city government, state government. And then they basically leverage federal money. What we now have emerging in the US, which is really quite remarkable, we haven't seen this for decades, is almost something like a modern style industrial policy, where the federal government is basically saying for the country to compete, we're going to have to harness all of our energies, particularly in a set of geographies, if we're going to be at the lead of next generation technologies, from AI to robotics to cyber, et cetera. So if folks, if places are not able to cross the sectoral divide, then frankly, I don't think they're going to be competitive for federal money, and they can try to do it on the private side, but the private side will be, leveraging up public sector capital. So we're about to see a certain kind of competition in the US, and a bunch of places that frankly were able to get their act together, whether it's through opportunity zones or through market dynamics, they're going to have a jump here. So we will see. But the message right now, that is being sent is, if you haven't really thought about how to leverage, what your natural assets are economically across multiple sectors, well, it's a pretty damn good time to start, or else you're going to miss out, I think, on what is going to be sort of a resetting of the spatial distribution of the U.S. economy in some very interesting ways.
Well, and David, I'm curious because of the emphasis of talent that you have. When we talk about aligning partners to take on these agendas that we're talking about in terms of innovation districts and having this, how was it for you all in terms of getting partners to the table? Sometimes partners who maybe didn't participate in this before, and getting them to understand that we do have to have more of a open logic in terms of how we innovate versus kind of how Bruce described, coming out of World War II, a closed kind of logic. Could you talk a little bit about how you were able to bring the right stakeholders to the table who represented different areas and sectors and get them to move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to oversimplify this, but if we can recognize at the base of this that we are squarely in the knowledge economy, and physical capital is no longer the constraint. It really isn't. Building more buildings and more capital, it's not the constraint, it's people. You talk to any business today, we hear consistently, we need access to talent. And to Michael's point, whether it's high school degreed with some level of skills or college educated talent, we need it all. It's not an or conversation, it's an and conversation. The advantage we have as a public institution is we're a Carnegie Level 1 public entity. So we view our role very much as we've got a public mission. But candidly, this wasn't hard. And it may sound, I don't want to sound trite, but when we went out and talked to Kroger, when we went and talked to P&G, when we went and talked to Fifth Third, they said, we need access to talent. Will you supply us the talent we need? And so we got them to rally around that issue. When we talked to the lieutenant governor and governor, okay, what's the number one issue we're facing as a state? Our most skilled individuals are leaving Ohio and they're going somewhere else. They're going to an Austin, they're going to Silicon Valley, they're going to a Boston. Candidly, we just lost a congressional seat here in Ohio. We're the 7th largest state in the nation. Texas picked up 2. If you go to Austin right now, you can figure out why. I mean, the place is going crazy. And the one challenge we collectively have is, how do we grow our talent? How do we attract talent? How do we retain talent in our communities? And not just highly skilled talent, but as the 7th largest state in Ohio, how do we grow the workforce talent here as well? So candidly, Andre, it's been about us doing. And as we've been doing, we've been bringing others along, because I think to an earlier point, not everybody gets this. If you live in Silicon Valley, you get it. If you live in New York, you get it. But in a community like Cincinnati, or candidly, a lot of our communities here in the Midwest, this is a new concept, and it's not always easy to ascertain. But I think you get the critical players to the table, the corporations that exist there, the entrepreneurs, the places that supply the talent, get them convened and figure out, how do you start solving collectively those problems? And I think that's something fairly quickly to do. And then I think as that comes along, I mean, I think one of the challenges we collectively have to figure it out, I think Bruce talked a little bit about this federal legislation. Our economic development policies as a state, as a city, as a nation have been focused on real estate. You know, we incent companies to do certain things. We got to start to look at policies. And I think a lot of that with what the federal government's talking about is we got to start looking at this around people, human capital. How do we incent the kinds of things that we want to happen in a city, a state, on a national level? You know, a simple example real quick is, you know, Toronto, you know, has a program through Mars and what they're doing. But, you know, if you got a STEM degree, they'll fast track you to citizenship. Now, it's just an example, but pre-COVID, they were importing about 50,000 people a month. So there's a recognition by their community. It's all about talent. And it's just one example, but I think we've got to rethink, you know, the policies around this as well.
Well, you bring up a good point, and maybe we can hear from each of you real quickly here, as I know we're running short on time. You know, we're working here in Memphis with a real estate development called the Walk-On Union. And one of the things we worked with them on a few years back was, you know, how they use their capital stack to support some of this activity that we're talking about, to build smarter infrastructure, to support entrepreneurs and academic, you know, diversity in terms of how we economically grow. And so we would love to see more of that in the region here, not just with one of these real estate development. How do we make that a policy? How do we make that a way to attract those types of resources? And because of that, that's bringing money in from outside the region to the region. So I'm curious, David, to your point, maybe we could hear from all of you on, you know, what are some of the different things where we have to get creative to generate dollars and resources for innovation districts that are out there. And any thoughts from any of you on that?
Yeah, I'll actually jump in. You know, it is about creating new ways of thinking around economic development, but those capital companies are there. It's really just about identifying them, right? There are private equity companies and capital companies that where they're LLCs and their C Corps, you know, but their primary objective is to, of course, to generate revenue, but there are incentives giving to them when those projects that they're investing in focus on social impact, right? So it's really just identifying those private equity companies and getting at the table with them to say, hey, we have a public infrastructure project here, right? And we'd like to, you know, partner with you. Hey, tell us what you think, right? Because that's exactly what we did in the city of Aurora, right? And that $300 million project that we're trying to finalize right now is to basically to deliver public infrastructure to the city of Aurora. You know, the incentives are there for them. It's really just having a conversation. And typically, municipalities aren't talking to these private equity companies off of Wall Street, you know, but they should be, right? It's a new way of doing business, you know, and I think that the municipalities, we need to be innovative to be out front, because a lot of these policies that we're talking about that need to be implemented, they're not there. But if you can set that standard, you can be the benchmark, you know, for those policies and start to create it, because you need to have that governance, right? You need to have a framework, right? Because there's nothing out there really now that exists that's kind of, you know, plug and play or kind of boilerplate, right? And it's going to be different for every municipality and or state.
And I would just, if I may, just pick up on Bruce's comment. I mean, I think the federal government has clearly identified we got a real issue here, that we've got to create a competitiveness relative to research, but we've also got to create a competitiveness relative to workforce. So there are going to be real dollars. They're going to be allocated to not only stage one, which is how do we help build these innovations, but innovation centers, but there's also an Innovation Centers Act of 2021 that's sitting at the federal government level that, you know, right now is to the tune of about $7.5 billion. So there's a seriousness in terms of the amount of capital that's going to be infused to really accelerate this. Because I think that's the challenge we all face as cities. If you look at Silicon Valley, you're looking at something that's 70 years old. You know, we don't have 70 years. So I think the cities that can actually pull this together and tell a story relative to how they would actually allocate this capital and really accelerate their efforts, I think we've got a real opportunity sitting in front of us.
I mean, I think what folks who are trying to build out these, you know, multi-purpose districts, I mean, this is going to be an exceptional moment. And to Michael's point, it is going to leverage private sector capital if done well. There's the State Small Business Credit Initiative, which has already been enacted, is $10 billion, which will have a 10x return. That is the perfect program built for innovation hubs. It's like the most important small business program that no one's ever heard of. It will never even be talked about with regard to innovation districts, except in a few places. So there's a bit of due diligence that has to happen now, because the funding, both on the public side and the private side, is about to be upended. But what it relies on is local design, local vision, local collaboration.
Well, I know we're hitting the end here. I really appreciate Michael, Bruce, and David, you all taking some time just to share some wisdom and actually some pretty tangible steps that can be taken and some ideas. I know I took a few notes and some of the things that we're working on here, but just wanted to say thank you and for having this discussion on innovation districts, and wanted to give the opportunity to thank Rachel again and Chelsea. Rachel, I'm not sure if there's anything else that you wanted to add here before we close out.
No, just really want to thank everyone for the extremely engaging session. I learned a lot and also think there's a lot to be applied both in Memphis, but cities throughout the nation. This session was recorded and we will make it available following this convening. And so I want to thank Starco for hosting this.
Sure. All right. Well, thanks everyone who attended. And again, thanks to all the speakers that helped for this conversation today. We wish everyone a good day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks.